My guest told me something early in this conversation that I think you'll want to hear. When she's close to burnout, she wants to do more work, not less, more. One more task, one more thing to get through before she can stop. She says that that's how she knows. Not the exhaustion, not the breaking point, but the acceleration, that urge to keep on going, just one more thing. And you may know that feeling. Most high achievers in demanding roles do, but we've never stopped to ask what it actually means. If you've been telling yourself you're coping fine and some part of you knows that that story is getting harder to believe, this conversation names what's actually happening. Not to add to your to-do list, to give you a clearer way of reading what your own system is telling you. We get into imposter syndrome as a systemic trap, not a personal failing. The beliefs you're swimming in so completely you don't even know they're there. And what happens when a leader decides to go home on time, and what that single thing, that single act does to the people around them. My guest is Aoife O'Brien, author of Thriving Talent and host of the Happier at Work podcast. And she's studied this for years. Working harder does not prove your value, but it might be pushing you into burnout.
Hi, Rachel. Aoife O'Brien here. I have a 20-year career history in corporate, and I really loved my career up until I didn't. I had a couple of experiences at work that put me onto the path that I'm on now. So my background is in market research, and I left my most recent corporate career and I went on to do a master's in organizational behavior, and my eyes were opened to all of this amazing stuff that I wasn't aware of. And I suppose part of what I want to do now is get the information that's needed into the hands of the people who need it most. So the leaders in organizations, in healthcare, wherever it might be, but to get that information into their hands so they can actually use it.
And you've just written a book. And what's the book about?
The book is called Thriving Talent, How Great Leaders Drive Performance, Engagement and Retention. And it's about how, as leaders, we can create the conditions for everyone to do their best work at work. So it's not about looking at employees specifically. It's about understanding how people do their best work. And as leaders, how we can actively shape those conditions so that those around us and ourselves can do our best work.
Brilliant. And I know that you work with leaders across many, many different sectors, and they're technically, these leaders, really, really good at their jobs, but privately they're running on empty. And I know your research looked at this in great detail. What does that pattern actually look like from outside? So how would you be able to tell that someone is really, really overextended, but sort of holding it together at work?
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest issue here is that we can't see from the outside that people are overextended, that they're holding it all together because they keep it hidden. So you as an individual might be feeling you're really stretched. You're completely, like when I feel it, because I'm human too. I experience these feelings as well. I feel overwhelmed. And when I'm close to burnout, I want to do more work. That's how I know that I'm close to burnout, because I'm so driven to want to do the next thing, just one more thing, and one more thing can turn into 10 more things. And I just keep focusing on the work, and I recognize that now in myself. And for a long time, I thought burnout was when you just feel exhausted and you don't want to do anymore and you don't have any interest. But what I noticed in myself is I want to actually keep going. I want to do more. But I think it's really hard to tell from the outside. From the outside, it looks like someone is coping really well. They may be a little bit stressed. They may be a little bit snippy with other people. But I think for the most part, they look like they're coping really well. But maybe on the inside, what's going on is, why is no one stepping in to help me? Why do I have to carry all of this myself? Why is no one making any decisions? Why is no one else doing what they said they would do? So from the inside, it might look very different than what other people perceive on the outside.
So it sounds like those sort of stories that we start telling ourselves when we become stressed become amplified. You know, I've got to do it all. Why is no one else helping? The only way out of this is to work harder and harder.
Yeah.
And then you just overwork. Do you think in burnout, maybe that decision-making process gets a bit warped, and we lose the ability to actually work out, is this important because it's actually important for the career, or is it important for other reasons, such as maybe not letting somebody down, or, you know, being seen to be okay?
I think that's a really good distinction that, and we talked about this before we started recording, this identity level, like I am the person who follows through on what I said I would do. I am the kind of person who gets stuff done. I am the kind of person who doesn't need to ask for help. And I think all of those kinds of things can get in the way. They are identity level. And I think maybe we don't recognize that in ourselves, or we don't recognize that we are limiting ourselves in some way by giving ourselves these identities. Like, especially, I'm the kind of person who doesn't ask for help. And I say all of this as someone who, again, is human and experiences all of these things myself. Like, asking for help is really hard for me. And I feel like the launch of the book was definitely a huge eye opener in terms of this is a team effort. This is not something that someone can do on their own. There were so many different moving parts. And I think that just asking people for their support during that time period and them saying yes as well was like, wow, if you're not used to asking for help and you ask for help and you get it, it's kind of unexpected, but it's also really positive.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what does asking for help actually look like? Because in healthcare, we're told all the time, if you're heading into burnout, ask for help, ask for help. And we did a survey of our listeners, and lots of people said that they didn't ask for help, not because they didn't want to, because they just felt it was futile. And some people had had experiences of asking for help, and they'd been told the only thing you could do is take time off. That's the only help you've got. Another person had phoned a psychology hotline, advice line, and there was a answer phone message that was 2 years out of date and said, well, we're not going to get back to you. So we're telling everyone to ask for help. And then it's futile when we do. We know actually they're not going to be able to help us. So I think that stops us.
Yeah. So I think we can look at that from two different ways. So if we think about it from, I've asked for help in the past and it hasn't been forthcoming or it hasn't been useful, then that probably builds this. And I know we use this term, and I love this term, before we started recording, learned helplessness. So therefore, I've taught myself not to ask for help because it hasn't been forthcoming in the past, or it hasn't been. I think as individuals, when it comes to asking for help, we need to recognize, what do we specifically need help with, and how do we assign almost like a task or a subtask to someone else to take care of. And I have a very kind of prominent and personal example that happened just yesterday, where I'm going on a long trip and I wanted to get the family to have dinner all together before I leave on this trip. And, I we're in the family WhatsApp group, and it was like, yeah, no, that sounds great. You just let us know where and when. And I just thought that I cannot cope with making a decision on where to go. And it's not that huge a deal, but it was just one additional thing on all of the plates that I'm spinning at the moment. And I just wrote back and I said, it would be really helpful for me if someone else could take care of this. If someone else could make a decision, if someone else could decide a time, tell us where to go. And I said that, and I suggested someone as well that might be able to help with that. And then that was off my plate. I don't have to worry about that anymore. And just the relief, because I'm trying to do so many things before I go on this trip. It was just one less thing to worry about. And that's how I approached it. I said, I need help with this. This is the very specific thing that you need to do. And I have a suggestion of who could do it, just because I know this person is the least busy of all of the people. So that's how I approached it. Like, it's probably in the past, I would have just taken it on the chin. I would have just said, okay, it's another thing to add to my list. I'll just kind of add that to the bottom of my list. But I just knew that I could not cope with that, or I would have done it really badly. And I think that's another thing to bear in mind, Rachel, where we think we're doing a favor by taking on all of this responsibility, by taking on all of these additional tasks. But you have to think how well you're doing each of those tasks if you're spread too thin across them all. So if you could do a better job, a higher quality job, by having less on your plate, by focusing more on the areas that you're really strong in, then what impact would that have on those other people around you? And it's not to say that you're doing less work. It's that you're doing more of the work that really lights you up and energizes you. You're taking some of that the things that you don't really need to do, or you're swapping out work with someone else. Because, you know, like we kind of talk about admin work as if like, oh, it's drudgery and it's repetitive. I kind of like admin work. So if someone didn't want to do their admin and they wanted to do more of what it is that they're good at, then we could potentially swap that out, because I you know, have an eye for detail. I can do that kind of stuff. So it's less about thinking like I'm taking on less work, and it's more about thinking I'm doing more of the stuff that I am uniquely placed to do.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I really like the fact that when you're talking about asking for help, actually you use a personal example, because
Mm,
a lot of pushback we get from listeners, and quite rightly, is I can't delegate. There's nobody to delegate to, and that work, that might be right. Actually, you know, everybody's pushed, but there's a lot of stuff that goes on outside of work. You know, life isn't just work, but we take on that as well, often because we're
yeah.
the most capable person. We're busy, and we just, I can't possibly ask someone else to book the table and organise it. But I bet that person you asked was really pleased to do that for you. You know, people genuinely like to
That's
help out where they can. And there are areas in our lives where we could quite easily delegate to other people. We just feel so bad
yeah.
doing it.
I think that that is another important point there that you mentioned, that people are so happy to help when they're asked. But and if you think, you know, think about yourself. When you're asked to help someone, when you're asked to provide support, how do you react? Do you say, no, I couldn't possibly, I'm too busy? Or do you say, I'm going to drop everything now. What do you need? How can I help you? And I think for the vast majority of people, and I've seen this as, you know, the receiver of support, as the receiver of help, the vast majority of people will drop what they're doing and they will support you, whether that, you know, and I'm thinking specifically on the book launch, people are like, I will support you in any way I can, but they need to be told explicitly what that looks like. And I think it puts the burden on us to think about what that might look like. And again, if I have a business example, so I had a call, it's probably, it could even be a couple of months ago at this stage, but it was with someone to help support with the admin side of things. So, like a virtual assistant to help me in my business, which would be the exact time that I needed it in the run up to the book launch. And with everything else that was going on, the burden was on me to think about what the tasks of that person might look like. And I realized it would also be a huge investment of time for me to spend training them on my systems, to make sure that they were doing everything right, to oversee their work. And it wasn't the ideal time while it was during launch. But at the same time, that's exactly the time that I could have used that support. In retrospect, had I invested that time, I would have saved myself a lot of time further down the line. But oftentimes we don't know how to express or how to explain, or we're afraid that someone won't do it as well as we would do it. There are so many things that are getting in the way of us asking for support. Sometimes we play, and I know you talk about the drama triangle, Rachel. So this, you know, we play the victim mode. Oh, poor me. I am so busy. I have too much to do. I'm stuck. I can't get out of this. So I think if we step out and say, where specifically do I need help? What can I ask people for? And how do I ask for that? And I think, you know, I've explained how I could really use support in this area and outline it very specifically. Yes, maybe you don't have someone that you can delegate to, but do you have something that you could potentially swap with someone? Is there something that's draining you that someone else like really gets lit up by? But it's thinking about all of those things. It is an investment of time up front, but you have to think about the payoff later.
Yeah, and I think the problem is that when you are heading towards burnout, that becomes very difficult to do. Like you said, it's
Yeah.
another job on your list, and delegating takes
Mhm.
time, and working out what you want that person to do takes time. So it's, you know, in hindsight, it's better to do when you're not burnt out, when you're actually thinking, how am I going to get
Exactly.
myself more capacity? But I think a lot of us have overworking as our defaults. I think we've been, particularly in healthcare, in high stress, high stakes jobs, we've been groomed for this overworking. We've been groomed for over responsibility, to always just accept the default responsibility for everything. So even if we are overloaded and heading towards burnout, if someone asks for something, we'll step up and say, yes, I'll do it, because we think, well, if I don't do it, no one else will.
Yeah. And we think that's just how it is. And I think that's part of what I wanted to challenge, because I came from an experience where I had such positive experiences early in my career and then such negative ones later in my career. I was like, I know that these positive environments exist, so I want to help people to create them.
So it's interesting about the environment that we're working in. And of course, that interacts with how we've been groomed, programmed, the underlying stories we tell ourselves. Now, a lot of our listeners and people I'm talking to are expressing an issue with confidence, second guessing themselves, sort of working as hard as they can, but as they get more experience, rather than their confidence getting more and more, it's actually dropping. And some people would say, well, we think, we're really suffering from imposter syndrome here. And I know that in your work, you talk about imposter syndrome as something that actually drives overworking, not sort of underperforming, but overworking. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So if we take a step back for a second and look at what you're saying there. So there is this curve called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it looks at competence over time on the bottom axis. So when you have a low level of competence, you don't know what you don't know, and you have a high level of confidence. So you think, wow, this is easy, I can do anything. As time goes on, you realize more and more about what you don't know. And so your confidence dips, and that's where imposter syndrome creeps in. It starts to creep in there. Because you're competent and you're capable, but you know that there's so much more to learn. So I wanted to put that into context. When we experience imposter syndrome, one of the things that we do to cope with it, to hide the fact that we feel that way, is to overwork, because we're overcompensating in some way. We're hoping that people don't realize that we are the fraud that we believe ourselves to be. And so we will overwork. And sometimes we'll even go beyond that and hide the fact that we're overworking, because we don't want people to know that we are overworking. So there's loads of dynamics going on there, but it is really about hiding. You want to do more work to hide the fact that you think you're an imposter.
And this feeling of being an imposter, it's this feeling that someone's going to find you out because you're not good enough to do the job you're doing.
Yeah, I just got lucky to be where I am. Someone's going to find out. It's, it's only a matter of time where someone is going to knock on the door and tell me, we've actually made a mistake. You were not the right person for the role. So we have all of these beliefs, and we can all doubt our abilities from time to time. The imposter syndrome feeling is more from what others think of us and how others are going to perceive us. So it's that kind of other element.
Yeah. So I perceive that in roles in healthcare, in these high stress, high stakes roles, the system is asking you to do the impossible, to deal with 60 patients in a day and still get home on time and stuff like that. And then when you can't do the impossible thing that the system's asking you to do, you feel like an imposter. You think, oh gosh, I'm not good enough. I don't have enough confidence. I'm going to be found out. But surely it's not imposter syndrome. That's actually just the system gaslighting you.
I think so. Yeah, that's exactly what that sounds like, that the expectation and the bar has been set far too high. And I think collectively, or let's talk individually first. If individually people are experiencing this, but they're not actually communicating with each other about what's really going on, to me that says there are not enough healthcare workers in wherever that is, if the expectation is you're going to see 60 patients in a day. And let's do the calculations on that. What does that turn like? Does that mean like 10 minutes per patient, but with no breaks or so? You know what I mean? What are the...
And it's mad, but that's what GPs, some GPs were doing, and they do talk about it, and they talked about workload, and GPs have just had a contract imposed upon them, which they have rejected. And so there is a lot of talk about workload. People are saying we cannot continue at this level. but then they're doing it. They're sort of just, so when we talk about 60 patient contact, it's phone calls, it's seeing people. It has got a little bit better, but there's still, a lot of people will still be doing like 13, 14-hour days very, very regularly. And even though they're saying this workload is too much, they are then feeling like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I cope? When they find it difficult. And they may be judging their colleagues who are saying we're not doing this anymore, or are going off sick with stress and burnout, because we have just been programmed to always be able to cope with it. To be the strong ones. We have this, what I call the superhero delusion, that we don't have the same physical human needs as the rest of the population. And I think that I don't know if you've seen that in the corporate world as well. So it's this very weird thing. If everyone is talking about workload, they're saying there's too much workload, we can't do it anymore, and lobbying the government and stuff, but then just getting on with it and doing it and taking the blame for it upon themselves. If I can't cope, that must mean that I'm weak.
I mean, there's a few things that we could talk about here. You have to think about, at the end of that 12-hour, 13-hour day, how well are the patients being treated? As in, do you get to an empathy kind of boundary, an empathy barrier? What happens after that phase? Are your cognitive abilities still the same after that amount of time as well? And the interesting thing, that superhero complex, like the superhero is this archetype of imposter syndrome that Dr. Valerie Young talks about. And it is that ability to be able to do everything, but in all aspects of our life. It's not just in work. So I have to be the best, colleague. I have to be the best manager. I have to be the best friend, the best daughter, the best mother, like all of these things combined. So that could be playing a role, that you feel this need, or you feel a sense of responsibility, but is there an underlying need, a driver that you have to prove yourself in some way?
I mean, that definitely happens, because, we overperform, not just in work, but outside of work as well.
I think we have different phases in our lives where we are highly ambitious, and then other times we're not coasting, but we've just taken the foot off the gas. And I was saying, I don't think I've reached that place yet where I've taken the foot off the gas. Sure, I've taken sabbaticals, I've taken big breaks from work, but I've never been in work and kind of felt like I'm coasting. I've always been really ambitious. So some people just have that drive, that kind of, I feel this inner drive to achieve all the time. And I caught myself an overachiever. And that's, like when I do something, I want to do it really well, and I want to achieve lots of things. And so it could be an inner drive that people have. But we also, again, personal example, we also need to recognize when that's hurting us and when it's helping us.
And I think people are recognizing that it is hurting them, but they feel stuck. They feel like, what do I do? What can we change? And it's interesting, because I know you do a lot of work around burnout and the system and the culture, and all our NHS organisations are saying that wellbeing is really, really important, and we want to stop burnout, we want to improve retention and stuff. And then they have these values about like looking after your staff and all that. But I know that you've described culture as what gets rewarded and tolerated and repeated. And the problem is that in healthcare, you are rewarded for that overwork. So they'll say we care about your well-being, but then the demands are, well, you've got all those patients that you've got to see them, we've got to cover those rota gaps, we're not going to recruit for that position. So actually what's happening on the ground is totally different.
Yeah. I think that causes a sense of mistrust when an organization is saying one thing, but they're behaving, or they're rewarding, or their processes and procedures say a different thing. So if people are getting rewarded and recognized, that's the first problem that needs to be solved. Is you can't keep recognizing and rewarding people for overwork while at the same time talking about well-being. If we bring it back down, and I know we touched on this before we started recording, but that kind of microculture that you create in that smaller team that you look after, you need to take responsibility and reward and recognize people for doing the things that are important. So whatever, is that metrics, and what metrics are they? Are they more about the quality rather than the number? are they? How many people on your team got to go home on time? And just thinking about things differently so that what you say and what you do are in sync. They're matching up. And you can think about it from that perspective, that you can create this smaller microculture wherever you are. You can influence the people around you. You can tell people to go home on time. You can create this environment. I think sometimes we feel like we can't influence things, but we actually can. I think sometimes we feel so helpless that we're part of this bigger system. And again, I probably had this delusion when I was in corporate as well. But if you're managing a group of people, you still can influence that small group of people. You may not be getting that same with your peers or with your leader, but you can still have that influence at that level.
It's interesting you say that. I was coaching a senior partner once, a GP senior partner, and their version of leadership was the leader has to be seen to be working harder than everybody else, to be the good leader, to show that they care. They can't be expecting their team to work harder than them. So as a consequence, this person was working, incredibly long hours, mopping up everything. And after a coaching session, they started, first of all, taking a lunch break, spending 45 minutes in a local park sitting under a tree. And I got an email from them a few months later saying they were going home on time. They were actually getting more done than ever before. They were actually making more money for their practice, etc., etc. But their mindset was that they should be seen to be doing more than everybody else.
Yeah.
Surely the problem is, if you do that, then your team see that is the way to get ahead, is to be working those hours as well, rather than modeling boundaries.
Yeah. So the leader in my mind needs to be the role model. You need to role model the behaviors that you want to see. It's not about what you say, it's about what you do. So, when I think of things like role modeling, I think if you're talking about well-being at work, you cannot be sending emails at 9 p.m. and over the weekend to your staff. That is not about well-being. And email systems all have delay send functions. So just set it to send the next morning. Even if you are working those hours, you don't want to show people that you're working those long hours. And I love this idea of like just taking a break during the day. It really helps us. And I need to remind myself of this sometimes as well. But taking that break during the day, just to get out, to get some fresh air, just to be away from the laptop, away from the office, away from the practice, really helps us to get that fresh perspective and be able to do work in a more effective way when we return to it. So for me, far from the leader being the person who has to do the most work, they are the one who needs to role model the behaviours that they would like to see.
That's hard though, isn't it? When the leader might be judged on, access to appointments, or, lists, or how many patients they've seen, or how well the team is functioning. How do you draw a line under your work, particularly when you're in high stakes work? There's this moral dimension as well. So, you're staying late, you're doing the work. It's not just because, you want to prove you're really good, but actually you're afraid somebody might be harmed. There's that patient safety element. There's that, like, well, somebody's got to do this work. So how can you separate this genuine ethical commitment to the job from this sort of habitual overfunctioning that you've been talking about? And do you think that organizations, consciously or subconsciously, groom their leaders to feel that they are the only person that can deal with these things, and that they do need to deal with them all the time and be on all the time and have their emails on all the time, so that they can sort out these issues at the ground level and overfunction at the ground level, so that the organisation doesn't have to bear any brunt for that?
I'd be curious to know where people learn these behaviours from. Are they learning it from their leaders? Are they learning it from the minute they start in that industry? I think we also need to challenge some of the assumptions that we have about work in general. So understanding. And this is when I was doing my master's, just prior to doing my master's, I did some coaching qualifications as well. And one of the challenges I had with that was around this idea of belief. So I was like, but how do I know what my beliefs are? And so often we don't know what our beliefs are because we're just in them. And I kind of equate this to a fish in water. A fish doesn't know it's in water. We don't know that we're in air. We just are. It's just normal. It's just how things are. And so trying to identify what beliefs we have. So do I have the belief that I need to be the rescuer, the superhero? Do I have the belief that I need to be always on? You may not even know that you have that belief because you've just been doing it without even really thinking or challenging what that belief is. So if we can identify some of those beliefs that we have ourselves, where we got those beliefs, and maybe challenge some of those to think, is this helping me or is this holding me back in some way? Then I think that goes some way to helping us in those situations to understand, well, where did I get this belief, and is it actually serving me?
What other beliefs did you see surfacing in the research that you did about work that sort of contribute to burnout?
Yeah, I think this idea that we need to always be on, that we need to keep working, that work is supposed to be hard. Like if work is easy, then it's not work, and for me, I like to challenge those assumptions and say, well, work, I think, should be fun. You should enjoy the colleagues that you work with. You should enjoy the work that you do. It shouldn't be too easy. It shouldn't be too hard, but it should have a sufficient challenge that you feel like, oh, wow, I really got something from that. I really had to use my brain to be able to kind of solve that issue or really think about that. So, like, I would like to challenge some of those assumptions. Some people still believe that, work is work, or I'm just here for the paycheck, whatever that might be. But I would really challenge that. Like we spend so much of our time. So, if you're working 40 hours a week, that's 8 hours a day. But if you're working 13 hours a day, what impact is that having on the rest of your life as well? The amount of time that you're spending at work. And if you're not enjoying it, if you're miserable, and if you feel stuck, like that's also a belief that you have. I feel stuck. I don't have a choice. I can't do anything about this.
Yeah, that's definitely a prominent feeling that we had. We came into this because we liked the work. We wanted to see patients, wanted to care for people. And then it's got too difficult. And now we're stuck and there's nothing we can do. And I think that is a belief, and I don't think it's true, but it's very difficult when you're in it at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, this concept of fun, I must say one of the beliefs I've always had is that work should be hard and you should always be busy, and I've always had things hanging over me, whether it's exams at university or then exams when you qualify and more stuff and more stuff and more stuff. How do you set about having fun at work?
That's a good question. Even in those toxic workplaces that I worked in, we still had fun. I still got on very well with my colleagues. And I think it depends, like different people have a different definition of fun. I think for me, the fun element is being able to have a laugh with your colleagues, being able to get along with them, being able to talk to them, like without breaking confidentiality or anything like that, but being able to kind of connect with them in a way that makes work actually quite enjoyable, that it's not drudgery, that it's not, oh no, here's my colleague Pete now, I really don't want to talk to him. It's like finding a common ground and being able to connect with people. That's really what it is for me.
And what role does values have in this in terms of alignment and fun?
Yeah, so for me, the biggest surprise I had, so when I worked in corporate, I knew about our corporate values. We had them on the walls, we had them in our email signatures, we had them on our website, but they were kind of meaningless. I'll come back to that in a second. But when I was doing my coaching qualification, this idea of values came up. When I was doing my research for my master's, this idea of values came up. And I thought, wow, this values thing must actually be quite important if it's coming up. And now it forms part of my framework, my Thriving Talent framework. And so the framework looks at psychological safety as the foundation. We have to have psychological safety. And then we've got 3 pillars. Now, the language has kind of evolved over time on those 3 pillars. When I first started looking at it, this was from my master's research, it was all about values alignment, needs satisfaction, and our abilities or our strengths. And then as I said, so they were the kind of 3 original. And then I've also since added a capstone on the model, which is about leadership. But if we come back to this idea of values alignment, I've since broadened it to look more at culture more generally. So it's not just about the values, it's also about the behaviors that we see. And it's about being able to address toxic workplaces, because I don't think any of us wants to work in a place that is toxic. And I don't think we want to create a work environment that is toxic either. So it's how do we, sometimes we accidentally create somewhere that's toxic. The values alignment piece and understanding, what do we stand for here? What behaviors are really important? What do we stand against? And having that really clearly. And this comes back to the idea of creating that microculture that you want to create. So yes, you're part of this wider system of the NHS, but that there are certain ground rules, but also how we get the work done is going to be led by what our values are, what we stand for, what we stand against, and making sure that the people you surround yourself with, that their values align with the values of the practice as well. So this is what we're trying to achieve, and this is how we're going to achieve it. And, coming back to this idea of fun, could you have fun as one of your values, that you don't take everything so seriously all the time? Yes, you're dealing with life and death situations, but not every situation is life and death. And how can you have a little bit more fun around that?
What do you do if you're in a team where you haven't started with, okay, let's all get our values out and aligned? We'll only recruit you if you're in alignment with our values. So you're working in disparate teams, some of which have been there for 20, 25, 30 years. So you sort of inherited your colleagues and you're very disparate and nobody's got the same values. What do you do then?
I think for me, it's finding that common ground. So, and I was talking about this on a podcast yesterday. How do you actually start from scratch? Maybe you have never done any sort of exercise around culture and the kind of culture that you want to be in. And it's very likely that people who've been there for a long time, if they're still there, then there's some sort of commonality. They haven't rubbed each other up the wrong way so completely that one of them has left. So let's assume that there is some sort of commonality there. But also, if you haven't clearly defined, if you haven't clearly said, this is how we want to behave, this is how we want to get things done, you have the opportunity to bring everyone together, to get together and say, how do we want to do this? And actually writing it down. And when people behave in alignment with those values, then you can call out that positive behavior. And don't forget to call out the positive behaviors, by the way. This is something I really suffer with. I can see very clearly when something is wrong or when someone hasn't done what they said they would do. But I find it much more difficult to recognize someone for probably what I consider them just doing their job. But if they do their job in a way that aligns with the culture, with the values, then that's something that's really positive and needs to be celebrated. On the other side,
can I just ask quickly, how do you call that out without sounding patronising? Particularly if you're not their boss, if you're in that, like, if they're a colleague.
Yeah, and that's a question I get all the time. I think find a way that works for you. So when you supported me the other day when I really needed it, I really appreciate it. Like, you don't have to say, and that was our value of support. You can say, listen,
just thank people.
Just say, thanks for doing this. It didn't go unnoticed. That has the double effect of recognizing people, noticing what they're actually doing, and telling them how what they're doing makes a difference to you in your day-to-day job. And I think it's beyond just the what they did, it's the how they did it as well. You showed up in a really supportive way, whatever that might be. On the opposite side is the calling out the behaviors that are not in line with the values. So we can, we could say something like responsibility or accountability can be built into the behaviors that we want to demonstrate. And then someone somehow abdicates responsibility or says, that's not my fault, or tries to place blame on someone else. Like that goes against the values. And it's kind of a tricky one because you want to make it known to everyone that that goes against the values, but you also want to kind of give the individual the dignity of having that conversation in private. But I think if you can let people know that this kind of behavior is not tolerated, then that will show them, okay, I'm going to get rewarded for showing this kind of behavior. I'm going to get reprimanded in some way for this other kind of behavior. Okay, it's kind of, I don't want to say, but it is kind of like Pavlov's dog. So you hear the bell ringing, you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. No bell, and you're not going to perform in that way.
I'm just thinking there's a danger there, isn't there, though, that you then start reinforcing the behaviours that the organisation wants, like, oh, thank you so much for seeing that extra patient and staying late and going the extra mile, versus
I think, yeah, it depends. It depends on what you want. So if you think about the values and the culture as the behaviors and the how we get work done, as opposed to the what gets done. So the what gets done is different to the how the work gets done. The how is more about the culture. The what is like the metrics and what are we actually rewarding people for. You know, at the same time, you can say, you know, how you treated that patient was very supportive and you took responsibility. That's really great. But we had already set a boundary that we were not going to see anyone after 8 p.m. or whatever that might be. So you can kind of do two at the same time. Like, yes, I loved how you did that, but actually what we're trying to achieve here, we're trying to set that boundary that we won't see patients after a certain time or whatever.
Yeah. And if you are in a leadership role and maybe you haven't got those values or whatever, but you're actually really worried about your team burning out, and so you probably need to address that first, what conversation would you have with them?
In relation to burnout, that you see that people are
Well, you see them staying later, you see them maybe the whole team aren't living what the values are, which is to, you know, say if you were in a department, you said, okay, our values are that we are not going to do the extra work, we are going to finish it at a reasonable time, and our values are that we want to be sustainable. Now, I don't think many departments have got those as their values right now, or even had time to think about them. But then you notice that actually, gosh, that people are really, really struggling here. So we've done the values work, or you might not have done the values work, but you've got to start somewhere. Where would you even start with these conversations?
I think having a group conversation about, well, what's working really well here, what's not working right now, and if people don't see it for themselves, because maybe they don't know what the future holds, and they're like, I'm just doing what's expected of me, I'm just doing my normal job, then it's kind of maybe not coaching them, but steering them in that direction of, if we do this for too long, then it becomes unsustainable. And I'm worried about your well-being. I think, you know, how are you feeling? What are you doing outside of work? What's supporting you? How are you staying resilient? How are you building up your own capabilities to be able to cope with this job on an ongoing basis? You know, because I think sometimes we forget, if you put in an awful lot of effort for a sustained period of time, there is going to be a point in time in the future where you cannot cope with that level of effort anymore. And I think if you do it in short bursts and it ends, then that's fine. And I'm thinking of like accountants, for example, they come to quarter end or they come to year end, and it's a really intense period, but then there's relief. But if you're in a practice, in a medical practice, then when does that relief actually come? It's just going to keep coming at you. And people need to be aware of that they need to build in something that is not work related, that they can have relief from work, and know that they cannot work at that pace at a sustained, you know, over a sustained period.
Yeah, I think most people in healthcare just go from one holiday, one block of annual leave to the next, and sort of collapse when they get to it. It's hard, isn't it? So you've got to sort of call out and reward and notice those behaviours that are really adding to the good culture.
I think so. And again, if you want to bring it back to like, how do we make more money for the practice? It's not good if someone is going to be working to the point of burnout and then has to take actual medical leave. what drives people to burnout? Is it the inner desire? Is it the responsibility? Is it something in them? Is it the superhero complex? Is it the rescuer? There's something there that's driving someone to continue working beyond their natural capabilities to the point where they just cannot do anything anymore.
Yeah. And it's really, really hard. And particularly when you're in a underfunded system, particularly
Yeah.
in the public sector, when there genuinely is work that needs to be done, there's not enough people to do it. And people will suffer to some extent if it's
Mm.
not done. Sometimes it can feel like you've got the leader's well-being versus the team's well-being. But you're right, if the leader just sacrifices themselves constantly, they will eventually be off.
Yeah.
And there'll be nobody to lead that team, and people will be worse off. So in your research and in your work, what things have made the biggest difference to help people set those boundaries and stop that overworking, that overfunctioning?
I think for me, there's this understanding of what our beliefs are, like what's driving us to do this in the first place. And if I come back to my framework, the things that help us to avoid burnout in the first place is that alignment of values that we touched on already. So how can you find that commonalities between, like, this is what I stand for, but then also looking at our needs or our drivers. This is something I certainly did not know when I worked in corporate. And by the way, we have personal needs and we also have needs at work, but understanding what those are. We have 3 universal needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competence. Autonomy is a sense of choice and control over what we do and how we do it. Relatedness is this sense of belonging that we feel with our colleagues, but also understanding how what we do on a day-to-day basis relates to the bigger picture. And then competence is feeling capable of doing your job. So being able to identify those things, and maybe you don't use the language of needs, maybe you just try and understand, well, where do I feel really frustrated at work now? Where can I do my best? Or what's getting in the way of me being able to do my best? Do I need clearer guidance or guidelines or instructions? Do I need less micromanagement from my superior? And being able to have those conversations and advocate for what you need and ask for what it is that you really need. So that's another aspect. And then on the capabilities side, it's understanding, well, where do my strengths really lie? Is it in patient care? Is it in the organization, the back systems? Like, where is it that I really excel? And how do I spend more time doing the stuff that I really excel in? Because when we do work where we're really strong, that is in our zone of genius, we feel energized by that work. We don't feel drained by that work. And it gives us more energy, and we're less likely to burn out when we spend more time doing that. So when our needs are satisfied, when our values are in alignment, and when we have the opportunity to work in our area of strength, then we are less likely to burn out in those situations.
Yeah, and I think we are particularly bad at working in our own area of strength and not working our area of unstrength, as it were. I wouldn't say weakness.
Weakness or developmental
areas.
Your zone of genius is where you want to spend a lot of your time, because if that's something, and we don't often recognize our own strengths because it comes easily and naturally to us. So we don't necessarily know. We just assume, God, that's so easy. Like, everyone can do this. We assume that we're not unique in that way. But in healthcare, you're not alone in terms of not having the opportunity to work in your area of strength, because in so many places it's just hard to do. We don't talk about strengths at work. We don't openly discuss these kinds of things. But I think if we started bringing those conversations more in, and even recognizing people for something that they do uniquely well, then I think it would start to make a difference.
And what's the best way of knowing what your strengths are and what your zone of genius is?
Yeah, so there are lots of both paid and free online tools that you can take. You can think about, well, what was I good at in school, or what was I good at in uni? You can see, well, what do my colleagues come to me to ask me about? And you can look at feedback, or like, are you getting specific feedback from your colleagues, from patients? Like, that's how we really identify. But also on a personal level, you can notice, when do you get into a flow state? When do I just lose track of time, that I enjoy something so much, that it energizes me so much that I don't even think about how long it takes? And so for me, when I got into those states, it was not what I expected. I was like probably in an Excel spreadsheet or something, doing some analysis. I'm like, that's where I get into that flow state. And it was totally unexpected. And I was like, okay, so this makes sense to me, because I'm quite analytical, I'm quite methodical.
I think we make the mistake of thinking, well, if you're a GP, you obviously have this type of strength, and if you're a surgeon, you have this strength, which is absolutely rubbish. Within those specialities, you definitely have different strengths. And if you're not in the medical world, if you're an accountant or a teacher, you don't have exactly the same strengths as the teacher next door to you. And it's been so important for me knowing what my strengths are, and then being able to craft my work and my career to play more to my strengths. And I think even in roles where you feel like your role is really prescribed, you can still do that to some extent.
Yeah, you can totally do that. Yeah.
Some people might say, okay, this is all very well and good, but I have tried to set boundaries. I've tried to say no. I've tried to ask for more clarity, and I've just been criticised. And if I have sort of spoken up, I've been passed over for projects or sort of promotions or leadership roles. And when I have drawn boundaries around my work, I've been subtly marked as less committed. Is that fear justified? And what's your sort of honest answer to that?
Yeah, no, I think it totally is, because that happens all the time. And it's not just in the medical field. I think it happens everywhere, that not only are we afraid of that happening, but it actually does happen. And I think, again, we need to shift the language around work from the number of hours that you do to the results that you achieve. And, what that looks like in the bigger picture, certainly from a corporate perspective, it is understanding, why are we here? What impact is it that we're trying to have with the work that we're doing? And how is that best achieved? It is going back to, like, did we just inherit this culture? Did we inherit this way of working? And how do we rethink how we actually work on a day-to-day basis? What that looks like, why we're here, what are we trying to achieve? Because I think when we enter into an organization, into a practice, we are in a system that already exists. We feel like we can't change anything. But if we start having those conversations about why are we here? What are we trying to achieve? And measuring ourselves against that impact, be looking at, well, what impact am I having on the bottom line? It's definitely the same in corporate. But beyond just that, why is it that we exist? And what is the impact that we're having?
It's interesting. I mean, healthcare, we don't like to talk about money, but bottom line is, if you can't afford to run your service, you can't afford to run your service. You've got
exactly.
To
yeah. You have to have a minimum.
You've got to be sustainable.
Sure, anyway.
Yeah, you got to make ends meet. And I think this whole thing about, setting boundaries and being criticised, well, yes, sometimes you've just got to learn to tolerate that and get the courage to be disliked, because in the long run, if you're sustainable and people see you setting boundaries and also doing the work really well, in the long run, you're much better off than those people that just stay, they burn out, or they say yes when actually they mean no, and they don't get it done. Don't get it done anyway, do they?
But you could be the person who changes the culture from within by doing that. So maybe you're hated at the start. Maybe people talk about you and you need to learn to advocate for yourself as well for what you're doing. But then also, when you start seeing the results from that, advocating for that and sharing that openly with other people so that they can learn from you.
I just want to ask you, just finally, when did you sort of personally start doing work differently, and what was the thing for you that really shifted it?
Yeah, I think there were a few different moments that I had. So after that experience, that first kind of negative corporate experience I had, I took some time out. I traveled for a year, and I picked up this book when I was in America called The Happiness Project by Gretchen Rubin.
Yeah.
And that kind of opened my eyes to this whole other world of personal development and like kind of looking after yourself a little bit more. And I think it's been an evolution, but for me, that first moment of, oh, things can be done differently. And yes, I do want to be happier, et cetera, et cetera. And like, I have a lot more in my control, in my responsibility than I probably had given myself credit for.
Yeah. And if you could give 3 tips to a high achieving but very exhausted professional who's convinced that the only way forward is to work harder, do more hours, more work, more proof. What would your 3 tips be?
I think so. The first one would be to grow in self-awareness, and you can do that by doing some internal reflection, but you can also ask people for feedback, like what is the impact that I'm having on you when I'm working all of these hours. Internal reflection might be around like what's the impact I'm having on myself, like am I getting close to burnout, am I putting pressure, unnecessary pressure on myself to perform when actually I don't need to perform at that level. And so I think that's kind of number one, is to grow in self-awareness. Number two would be to think about, well, what are my needs, what are my drivers, what's actually driving my behavior, and to understand where those behaviors are coming from. Is there an area where you feel maybe frustrated at work, where a need is going unmet? And so that's kind of number two. And again, requires a little bit of reflection. I think I'm big into doing a bit of self-reflection. And then the third area is understanding about our values and our behaviors, and making sure that our behaviors align with our values. So are we behaving in line with how we would like to behave, or how we would like to be perceived? And thinking about, again, you can think about the impact that you're having on other people through your behaviors.
And just the impact that role modelling has on other people as well, and leadership. Yeah. So what could someone do differently in the next 48 hours? One thing.
I think spend a bit of time and see, do I need to set clearer boundaries? Find out where, and like maybe you have a list of like, I need to set boundaries here, 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 here. Just pick one and stick to it. And that doesn't have to be, I'm going to finish work 2 hours earlier or 1 hour earlier. It can be something like, I'm going to make sure that I get out for a walk every day, and have that like self boundary where we're like, I'm going to make sure I do something for myself every day. That is going out for, taking a break at lunchtime. That is going out for a walk in the evenings to get fresh air, whatever that might be. I think that's something that once you just start doing things like that, like I find when I change location, or when I change situation, that's when I stop doing that stuff. And I need to remember, if I'm in a different location or if I'm in a different mindset, I need to make sure that I do that stuff, because it just, something flips in my head. So remember to do that stuff.
That's great. Aoife, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And we'll have to have you back at some point, because there's so much more we could talk about.
Yeah, I've loved the conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
If people want to get hold of you, find you, read your book, how can they find out more?
Yeah, so best place to go. I mean, you're listening to a podcast now, so definitely go and check out the Happier at Work podcast. Search wherever you get your podcasts. It's on YouTube as well. And the book is on thrivingtalentbook.com. And the book goes into a lot more detail on some of the things that we touched on. And if you like what I have to say, or if you're curious about how to apply that sort of stuff in your own practice, then definitely go and check it out.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll put all those links in the show notes, and good luck with the book.
Thank you so much.